tell you what I really think before she gets here. In March 2020, my grade 2 class went online. It was awful. We were living at Grandma's house, and we were all trying to work in different rooms. Here's a picture of Mum and I working at the dining room table. We make it look simple, but it wasn't. The next year, our school went online again in April. And then last year in grade 4, Mum and Dad kept me home extra because of baby Hugo. Mostly I don't like online school, but it is really satisfying to walk into an office and do my own thing on a computer. But when it was actually synchronous class, I just brought my Nancy Drew and read while the teacher took up math. Otherwise I would have fallen asleep because it was so boring. Most of my friends kept their cameras off, but I like to keep mine on. I get the feeling that every other kid is playing video games during online school. My mom and dad don't let me play video games. Not that I mind much, but Nancy Drew is my thing. Mom is going to come up soon. She doesn't know I'm making this intro to her video. She just wanted my help with the later parts. But I'm here to tell you, online learning is terrible, and you should not do it unless you are a professional. I better get back to my book and finish this chapter. Bye.
And what did you like about online school? Are you the same as your sister?
No.
No?
I like online school because I have Lally Lois is a reading program that I kind of liked, and I also have Zorna Math, which is like a math program.
Online math program is fun. Reading program too.
And if the teacher was like talking, I didn't really listen. I would just play with Lego. I didn't have the Lego here before. I had it downstairs.
Yeah.
Okay, so that.
Welcome, everyone. So great to have an opportunity to talk to you about virtual teaching and all the lessons that I feel have been thrust upon me for the last 3 years. I had never even taken an online course before COVID forced us to go online in March 2020. And I was very, very fortunate that at the time I was teaching 1803. And so I'm going to share with you this evening the tips from my students, their ideas for how to teach. Those are the tips that I used. And so here's the big secret about Grace's professional work. It was all student designed. All the ideas I have for online learning were from students with a bit of help from other places, but I'm just so thankful every day that the students were willing to share their ideas and that I teach in higher ed, which of course is a space where we can talk about this. So do you remember those early days of COVID? We moved into my parents' home because we're living in a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 kids. We used to take our mattress out and sleep on the living room floor at night. It was a very Toronto thing to do, and it worked for us until they told us to stay home, homeschool our kids, and work. And at that point, we were all stuck in this space, and my kids were like licking the elevator and sharing germs. And so my parents were kind enough to let us stay in their extra bedrooms. So here's a picture of my daughter and me working at she's on virtual school. I'm editing something. And on the right is my sister, who would also come over. She's a science department head at a high school, and she is making the disappearing kid phone calls in this picture. So she would sit there and call the parents whose kids they just hadn't seen in a while, which is pretty heartbreaking, actually, because these are the kids who COVID really put a wrench in their learning and really changed their motivation. And many of them wouldn't finish high school properly or on time. So one of the interesting things about the switch to COVID was I got lots and lots of emails. All these emails, here's a resource or here's a resource to help me to put my courses online. But there were no mandatory meetings and there were no conversations. There was no sort of workshopping this together to figure out how I could put my courses online. And as an interactive learner myself, that's what I really needed. So I would click on the link and it would say, here are some tips for online learning. And it just didn't do it for me. And at the same time, between sort of March 17th and the 1st of May, I was on this countdown, a countdown to get my course 1826 online. It was the first time I had taught the course. It was being adapted from a 12-week course to a 6-week compressed course. And of course, it was designed by Dr. Hayhoe, so the syllabus was like 38 pages long. And this was a lot of pressure. But at the same time, no one was watching. I had a lot of freedom in what I did with it. And so I was able to take a course that was a 3-hour course, half lecture, half discussion. And I was able to adapt it to have very different assignments, very different engagement. And no one was watching. And for me, that really worked. I felt like I could say, this is what I want the course to look like. And to avoid working in a hole, I would call in my husband a lot and say, like, what are you doing in your world of nonprofit facilitation? And I would ask my sister, the high school teacher. I've put a link in the video here. You can see her blowing something up on her back porch. The risk of COVID was that the teachers took their science to their houses rather than their laboratories. And she said that was particularly scary when it almost did sort of backfire on her. Anyways, so I had those two as my thought partners, and together we workshopped the courses in a totally new way. But I think what we need to ask ourselves before we go any further, particularly for this class, it doesn't just need the tips and techniques. You guys need to be asking the bigger questions. I want you to pause this video and I want you to ask this question or answer this question. Is online learning qualitatively different than in-person learning? Are we able to just take all the things and put them online so that they're just online things? Or are the things themselves totally different? Is it possible to have the same level of engagement? Or does online learning lack a thing? You saw a little video with my son, JJ, and he liked it. He liked online learning. But as a grade 2 student, does he actually need more than what he thinks he needs? Is there more engagement than online reading and online math that he needs to have? What about his social skills? What about his ability to work in groups? And my daughter, of course, doesn't like online learning as much, but she hasn't told me as much why. Okay, pause this, go to the discussion board, answer your question and chat with your friends, and then come back. So in mid-March, when the University of Toronto shut down in 2020, I opened a discussion board in my 1803 formerly in-person class. And I said to them, what are your best practices? And I had some guiding questions. Have you taken an online course? How many? What subjects? What level of degree? And what were the best or worst assignments and activities that you had to do? What was the best and worst practice of the instructor? And then, of course, just any other thoughts that they had. And I cannot tell you how important this was to guiding my practice in the next 3 years. These students were amazing. They're a really thoughtful group. Many of them had not taken 1803 in their first semester, so they already had some academic stuff under their belt by the time I got them, and they were confident to share their ideas. I had a couple of college instructors, lots of program administrators. I had a pediatrician, a librarian, people who were coming with professional experience and had a lot to offer around this question. So I've turned this into several key principles that I want to give you today to talk about online learning best practices. The first principle is to connect with all students individually. You'll notice in the quote below that this student, their response to the question was, in the first week, I had an instructor who organized a quick 10-minute video call. So we had a chance to connect with her about our aspirations and expectations. And I think that this was possibly for me the best piece of advice. I really felt like this anchored all of my courses. The funny part was that I'm sure I've shared this with you guys. I thought I would be doing this with maybe 20 students. That was kind of the average enrollment for 1826. But as we know, in spring of 2020, all of our course enrollment at U of T went up by apparently about 30%. So I had 56 students and I had already signed up and committed to doing one-to-ones. And I love people, but it was like eating too many Skittles or M&Ms. I was like, I would feel sick after I'd have sort of 9 back-to-back meetings. But I also paired this with an intro survey. So coming into that meeting, I knew a little bit about the professional background, their goals, what they'd already taken. So the conversation could really be about them rather than filling in just the data gaps. And the other thing I've learned to do over the last 3 years is use my tech to help make my personal connections more authentic. I take notes on every student meeting that I have. I have an Excel spreadsheet and I make sure that I've documented so that next time I come across that student, I can go back and I know what we talked about before, because it's impossible to put that and store that in our little reptilian brains. We need if we're going to deal with students en masse, we need really good systems to make sure we document our interactions with them in a good way, not documenting for legal protection, but documenting to make sure I get your story right so that I can build on our last interaction. So this I've done for every course I've had. And I really struggled to know whether to do it this fall for my first time back in person with 1803. So I did do it, but I didn't find it quite as dynamic because I'd already met them in class. And I chose not to do it for 1822. And I'd love to hear your perspective on whether you would have liked to have that or not. The other piece about this, which is really interesting, was that I was choosing to only do an optional 1-hour class. And in some ways, I felt like I needed to justify sort of my existence if I wasn't there for 3 hours with students doing stuff. And so this was one way that I could say, yes, I am individually mentoring students, and I'm going to do the stuff that I like, that builds my relationship with the students and that kind of connects to my personality. And I'm not going to do a 3-hour class. So this was kind of a time situation as well. This student also, at the very last sentence, actually says that they would have liked a mid-semester check-in as well, which is kind of cool. I've never done that. Principle 2, build student community. So this was an interesting one because one of the things that students mentioned was that peer-to-peer connections in an online class can get jeopardized. So they can connect with a professor, they're seeing our videos, but they don't necessarily know each other at all. And another student said, don't make me just comment on 25 different posts. Like there's nothing authentic to that. There's no conversation. So this led me to develop what I called learning pods. This puts students in groups of 6 or 7, which I think has worked. That's been about the number. And they have their own homepage on Quarkus and Canvas. So I use tech for that. They did group activities together each week. They gave each other paper feedback. And it was a way to make sure that you had people that were your people. In subsequent years, some of you would not have seen this, I actually made my first class mandatory. So you had to show up to the first class, and then I did breakout groups for 20 minutes to have the pods introduce each other. So I had the online pods, but they had actually met each other that first week. And then from then on, the in-person, the synchronous class was optional. So in our live Zoom, they met the first week, it was mandatory, and then I released the pods to do what they did. One thing I've done with these pods, though, is I've actually required them to participate by certain times. I didn't do that the first 3 or 4 classes, but I found that if someone just fills these in November, but we all had the discussion in mid-October, it doesn't work. So I do just give them a completion tick to make sure that they participated within the week that it was intended to have the conversation. And one of the things that's really important to know is that one group always fails. You can lead the horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. You can create great breakout rooms for students, give them a homepage, give them activities, doesn't mean they're going to chat with each other. And so sometimes in a mid-semester, I need to restructure a group. There's 2 students who are super engaged and active, and they're feeling all left out, and they're hearing that this pod over here is meeting for coffee, and that they don't get to do that. And so I take them out and I put them in different pods, and I send nasty emails to the other students to tell them that they need to step it up in their group. That doesn't always work. Usually they're just their life is really busy and they've just decided that 10% is not worth it for them. And the emails are not actually nasty. Just to clarify, since this is on my public YouTube channel, okay. But just remembering that one group fails, and that's just a part of it, and not stressing too much about that. Principle 3, simplify your course goals. So one of the comments from a student on my original question board was, one of their comments was, make your key concepts really clear. So make sure that we are constantly coming back to why we're all doing this. And also have the instructor post online. So you're as active in that online space as the students are. I also tried to make a principle for my online courses because there's a social detachment that I was always available. So every student's getting a response within 6 hours. I had to check my email, but it works. I just have these sort of times in a day, even on a weekend, that I check in at 10, I check in at 2, I check in at 9. And this is really important. I've had professors say, you know what, I just let students know I'll respond in 48 hours. And I get that, but we have professional students who I think are working on the weekends. We know they're online then. And if we can get them timely answers, that's helpful. I also have an ongoing frequently asked questions page. And in my online courses, it gets used a lot. You guys aren't using it as much because you're an in-person class, but the online students really use this. And this actually saves me the emails. If it's a public question that everyone needs the answer to, put it on the Quarkus site. And sometimes I'll find that students answer it for each other before I answer it. And there also is a bit of student training that goes with this. You need to actually tell a student who emails you directly to put it over in the Quarkus site. You actually have to put up that rule, or else they won't use it. So once you've trained them in the first 3 weeks to use it, it works really well. Is that behaviorism? Great question. So in 1803, I developed very simple questions. Every week I would say, what's the purpose of higher education? Based on that purpose, what types of institutions would we design? Who runs it, who funds it, and who is or is not part of that institution? So 5 clear questions. Each of our weeks would fit into that in a different way, and I'd mention them each week on the live session or in my video lectures. Principle 4, design for online. So we're not just taking a in-person class and modeling it online. It's an option. We can do a 3-hour thing with some static, with some lecturing happening live. But I chose to do a flipped classroom model. So I pre-recorded my video lectures so that they were not happening online during the synchronous time. This is because my internet got unplugged the first week of my first online class in March 2020. And I thought, had I been lecturing in that, a student would have lost the connection. Or if the student had had that happen at their house, they would not have been able to watch the video. So we never want to rely on the tech. We want to be able to give them the static content so they'll never miss the lecture, even if their Zoom's not working one night. We're actually at a place where I have very few tech problems with Zoom now. At the very first summer, it was pretty intense, but now it's pretty good. I tried to keep my lectures to 30 minutes max. It was just a good rule. When guest speakers came, it was a lot harder. So my guest speaker stuff gets up to 40 or 50 minutes. I like to do question breaks in my discussion board. I'm only doing 1 for this lecture, but I like to have 2 or 3, and it links back to what I would do for the learning pod activity that week. So I would have the question text mirrored on the learning pod so those 6 students can discuss it. So it's just an option of how to do a lecture, but with some breaks so they can process and think with it. And I did make my Zoom classes short, and I made them optional for most of my classes, especially 1803. The simple reason for this is I wanted to weed out non-participators. I just wanted the students there who wanted to learn verbally and interactively in that discussion setting. Other students may not feel it's worth their time, and I don't want them there with their cameras off. It sort of, for me, I felt socially like it detracted from the quality interaction. But that was just a choice for me. And of course, not having a 3-hour class was in direct response to this student's comment. And they actually had seen my first lecture during lockdown by this point, and they said they really liked it. They liked that they had these 2 breaks, and it gave them a moment to do the activities and the lecture bit by bit. Principle 5, give them options for assignments. This is, of course, building off the work of Ken Derry at the University of Toronto's Mississauga campus. He gives his students choice in their final assignment. Do you want to do a presentation? Do you want to do an essay? Do you want to do a reflective piece? I think he has the option of a sock puppet show or a puppet show of some sort, but no one's ever taken him on it. And this was a very common comment from my students in 1803. They said, use different formats, like creating a video or creating an infographic. This student is actually a college instructor who gave me this advice. So they had taken 2 courses on how to teach virtually at a post-secondary level, and then they had taught a lot. So this student was like the gift to me during this time. She's amazing. And she talked about using Google Slides, giving them to the students as a live space that they can interact and solve a problem. So case studies that they would have to solve together in this document. And so those of you who took my 1803, there were often these sort of links to something that you would do together. I have a lot of learning, I think, to do in this. But she also, at the bottom there, talks about some really good guiding questions. What's the problem or issue? What are the consequences if we don't deal with it? Engaging and captivating questions are really at the center of everything I think we need to do in courses, but also online, because there are limits to engagement. So the way that I addressed this I think I'm talking. Can you guys hear that? You may not be able to hear this, but I've started to talk because this slide is from a instruction PowerPoint that I give students that has a voiceover. I just heard myself suddenly. So these are the 12, 14. These are the 16 options that I give students for how to respond to a reading. So each week they have 2 to 3 readings. They need to take one of those readings. They can take them all, and they need to do one of these activities. And it's their way of responding and engaging with one reading. In my classes that I do synchronous mandatory participation, I make the students then present their activity to their students. And in my live classes, I'm still using this activity, but I then make them present to their colleagues. And this has been the most rewarding activity I have ever, or assignment I've ever developed, because I actually really like marking it. The course that was given to me for 1803 years ago had the students do 6 critical reflections. If I have 30 students, that is 180. Is that right? Yeah, 180 things I have to mark. And then I also have to mark their final papers, and it's just how. And so this is a document that I open up, and I'm so excited to see what my students have developed. I have regular writing activities. So same thing you would do, take a quote, explain it to me, do a critical analysis, do a blog style piece. So I want a lot of them to practice their writing. So I will actually ask certain students, I'll say, could you please do this so I can see your writing before we go any further? So I have to do a writing activity. They need to do some analysis activities. This is actually a timeline of a student's life from birth to graduation. And they've actually linked it really nicely to the reading to say, this is what happened to the student, and here's what the reading tells us about that experience they're going through. And this is a creative piece. So you have here, I don't know if you can see it with my face here, you have here interactive students around tables talking to each other versus the transmission mode where we are lecturing. And how much do you love it? I really think these Lego guys look really bored in picture 2, but they look really engaged. If Lego can look engaged. So it's just a great way to have students do something creative. I pair this with a 200-word written explanation because I think it's totally not fair to just have to do Lego. But you guys could, I'd love to hear what you think. Do we need the written explanation, or should we just be allowed to do Lego? A big piece of this assignment for me, and I explain this to students, is to give students pre-writing organizational tools to get their papers going. One of the biggest challenges for students when they start a master's degree is being able to communicate in the academic language that is written essay style. And so often you'll get paragraphs that are in the wrong spot, paragraphs that have 4 or 5 topics in them. And so these are ways to help the students to organize their thoughts before they go into their writing. Principle 6, use good tech. A frequent comment from the students that were giving me advice was to record a video. They really like that. In fact, even students who didn't like it originally, like were hesitant about it, really liked it in the end. And one of the most fun activities that I do in 1803 is to have students videotape themselves doing something they're failing at using Flipgrid. And one of the things I want to do for students, especially students who are going to teach in higher ed, is to show them what it feels like to do technology. Is this uncomfortable for you? What supports do you need to put in for your students to make sure that they're not uncomfortable? If you're uncomfortable, they're uncomfortable. How can we use that sort of interactive media tech? Wow. There are also other great technologies that have been developed, Padlet, Mural, Canva, things that students can use to just do a better job of their presentations. And Mural and things like that are actually, people can work on them collaboratively online, like a whiteboard idea. And these are really great. In terms of sessions that I would recommend, if you are going to attend a session, attend the sessions by these people who advertise or promote these technologies, because those are inspiring. It helps you not just be like, this is how you should teach online, but this is a tool you can use to do your online teaching well. And sometimes you do really need a session to help you to understand all the options that are available for these technologies. Students also said that quizzes are not helpful. They just test your knowledge on how fast you can find the page in the textbook. And this is really an important thing to keep in mind, because it's easy to do online quizzes to see where our students are at and to think we're assessing them well. And I would argue that we're not. But again, I'd love to hear your conversations and ideas about that. Authentic engagement, principle 7. So this relates to how I'm trying to get students to participate. So on all fronts, they authentically engage. They meet me at the beginning, then they meet their student groups. They have something to engage. They have activity to do with a reading each week. They can come to class. They can do their learning pod. There are breaks in the lecture video so they can respond to that immediately. So almost having all these touch points to meet all of your learning styles and all your personality types that are in your class. How can we do this? And I think, again, captivating questions, so important. This student says that they totally agree with their classmates that just open posts on discussion boards are not helpful. So for me, even in in-person classes, this is something we had when in the early 2000s, when online Blackboard is what we used to use, and CMS and stuff like this. When this stuff, I think it was called OASI Connect was one of them. We have been through generations of things. This was something that you'd see a lot. So write 200 words and then comment on 3 people. Well, if there's 25 people, those comments have no continuity and no connection. And if it's a good group, it works. But as these students say, often it just seems like I had to write 3, so I write 3. There's no meaningful substance. So we want to change this to have it done in small groups, have it relate to an activity, and have it based on a captivating question. So this was my fabulous student, the college instructor. She gave some tips for instructors, best practices. So here are some general guidelines now that I've done my brilliant principles. So give precise and detailed instructions from the beginning. This way you don't get a lot of emails from your learners. And this is huge. Put all the work in to organize your online learning system before the semester begins. I actually always have this absolute panic in my heart when I click make it live or publish my site, because I know there are going to be some broken links and some questions. But if I nail it, I won't get any questions for at least a week. And then I know that it worked, that we've got a strong organizational system going. Challenge your learners to think outside the box, things like the learning portfolio, creative responses to readings. Experiment with your digital tools. Be reflective. As a professor, if you're asking students to film a video, film one of yourself, especially something silly like failing at something. If you're asking students to join in online group participation, make sure you pop in and populate that as well. Try to think from a student lens. Reach out to your students, trusted students. You can always, in every class, have student allies, someone who say, hey, can I just get your opinion? I'm thinking of doing this. Will it work? Thanks, Lori. Recording videos is huge. This is something that students really, really liked, and it's just more engaging than having just voice over PowerPoint. And I love this idea of leading by example, act as a role model, practice what you're teaching. So if you want your students to be respectful in their comments, be respectful to your students. So here are a couple of other considerations that were important for me. Timing. I was taking a course that was 3 hours each week in person and trying to put it online. I will not cover the sort of condensed course. We can talk about that later if you want. But for a 12-week course, how do I then know that my students are getting enough if I move it online? So in my in-person course, I had 3 hours of class, and I had the prep that students would do. And I've heard from students it can take anywhere from 3 to 6 hours to kind of dive into the readings and get themselves prepared for class, perhaps do a small assignment that's due, like a reflection or paper proposal. So how does this translate online? I decided to do 1 hour of live class only. I decided to consider the learning portfolio activity the 2nd hour and the group activity the 3rd hour. So in terms of what I was considering my class time, those 3 pieces were the class time. Then, of course, there's the regular prep. They still need to do their readings. They still need to do proposals and other assignments. So that's how I translated it timing-wise online. Again, no one asked, which I always think is interesting, because at some level, someone should have been asking me about things like seat hours, because those are pretty big conversations we tend to have in higher education. The second question that I've been really thinking about is this idea of having your cameras on, which I plan to require of you this evening. I had just assumed, because I had seen my sister working with high school students, that it was always cameras off. But there's actually a big difference between school boards and professional people at OASI. And we don't have a policy at the University of Toronto that our cameras need to be off to respect people's privacy. In fact, there are lots of advancements now in tech, so we have different backgrounds students can use, and there's not a risk anymore of them having their cameras on that we could see into their homes or violate privacy. You're also not under 18. And so when I was TAing for Dr. Hayhoe, helping her get her course online in fall 2020, she started the first class by saying, well, this is an online learning community, and you all need to turn your cameras on. And they just did. And so my class was the next day, and I said, okay, guys, turn your cameras on. And then they did. Of course, I would always give students an out. If you have something happening and tech's not working, or you're actually doing this on lunch break for work, because you work at a hospital, so your lunch break is 5 o'clock at night, you can let me know. I just can't have my camera on. So always giving students an out, but then to say that our baseline expectation is that cameras are on. And this made such a big difference. The third thing, of course, is mental health. COVID hit hard. I found that my first semester, the young men who lived on their own and worked at a university or college, and their social life was their work community because they may have been introverted or just quieter people, they really suffered. And so I would have these students who say, actually, I can't keep going. And then what sort of supports do I have for them? And then how do I catch them? How do I make sure that we're not getting to the point where they're dropping out, that I know that they're not okay ahead of time? This is very COVID related. It's not all online courses I don't think it's the nature of online courses that it leads to mental health. So you guys could prove me wrong in our discussion board, that's fine. So mental health, I do what's called a comfort check, and this is borrowed from my husband's work with facilitation with marginalized communities through his nonprofit work. They would do an activity or have a conversation, and they say, let's just do a quick, out of 5, how are you doing? Or out of 10, how did that feel to you that we just did? Just making sure you're regularly checking with people. I use it at the beginning, and I say to students, if you're saying 3 or below, it signals to me, because they can private message me in the chat. I usually just put this in the chat. It signals to me that you need me to reach out. And I've had a few students do that. And I just reach out, how are you doing? Do you want to talk about it? And then having a list of therapists and university supports that they can access. And then I ask if you have 7 or 8 or above out of 10, tell us your good news, because during COVID, we really needed to celebrate and feel okay saying that I had something good, because it wasn't always easy to say that if other people are really struggling. So wanting to be able to acknowledge both the good and the bad of life. Okay, so that's my thought. Those are my thoughts on online learning. I'm looking forward to discussing this with you tonight in class. Bring your ideas. I'd love to hear how you would adapt this to your practice, what works for you, what doesn't, and have a great day.